First of all, the thing I just wanted to highlight is some findings of the review of snaring for the Scottish Government, which took place in February 2022. For those that are unaware of this, basically, under the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act that was passed, there was a review of snaring that took place every 5 years. And in the latest review, which was in 2022, it did give us some insights, I suppose, as to the scale of snare misuse in Scotland, which I think perhaps might be quite instructive in this regard, especially when talking about those potential negative implications. So the total number of standard prosecution reports received by the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal between 2012 and 2016 was 23, and between 2017 and 2021 was 18. So there has been a reduction there. And the other thing that I just wanted to highlight, Convener, because I think it really is an important point, and it was touched on by the Minister last week, but the review was very clear about where it felt the issue was with regard to illegal snare use and, by extension, those welfare implications. And it said, and I quote, "The review group consider that it would be very difficult to legislate for the actions of individuals where the modus operandi is to undertake an act of snaring with the intention of committing an associated crime." So, and they go on to say that the cases prosecuted tend to point to deliberate abuse for purposes ranging from poaching to badger persecution. To be clear, that is completely distinct from illegal snare operators and what they do, and I'm sure the practitioners in the room will have more to add about how they go about safeguarding animal welfare when utilising these devices, Convener.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Glenn Evans, but I'm aware...
We've done a survey ahead of this evidence session taking place where we basically surveyed 129 land managers in conjunction with Scotland's regional moorland groups. Of those 129 responses, 98% of them said that there would be a negative impact on biodiversity if this goes through. These are the experts, the people that work on the land and know best ultimately what would happen. And indeed, if you actually look at that further and try and understand the implications on job losses, we asked them if snares and cable restraints were to be banned, do you think it would result in job losses? 72% of those that we surveyed said yes. So that is just to highlight the extent and scale of what we're talking about here. And last week we were really struck because we didn't think that the Minister was able to really articulate the scale and extent of snare use in Scotland, which are now being largely superseded by HCRs, I'm pleased to say. 61% of foxes in Scotland, broadly, we think, are controlled using lamping or thermal, and 39% are controlled using snaring. 0%, to our knowledge, are controlled using live capture traps. And it's for all those reasons, Convener, that we think that the licensing scheme that we and alongside others have devised constitutes a compromise approach that would ultimately enable cable restraints, humane cable restraints, to continue to be used under licence. And the licensing scheme is predicated on the land, and that's really important because it is the characteristics of the land, be it topography, be it cover, be it wind blow, that necessitates snare or HCR use. And that's a really important point to note. And we have included things in the draft licensing scheme, such as, you need to make sure that Nature Scots would have to be satisfied that no other method of fox control is reasonably practical on the land. So we are talking here about broadly, it needs to really be the last resort, but there are some places where it is absolutely instrumental, and we cannot get away from that point, Convener.
Can I just ask, have you any indication of how many old type snares are currently being used as opposed to the new humane constraint devices?
We've been kind of, alongside the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust and the Scottish Gamekeepers Association, really been pushing the use of the humane cable restraints. It's not widespread at this point, and that's because the current code-compliant snare in Scotland it necessitates the type of snare completely different from a HCR. So it's only been trialled by a handful of states, including Connor's estate there as well. But I think the important point to note is that at the moment, Scotland's code of practice, it basically has got a snare within it that is not a HCR, despite what you've been told by certain people, Convener. It is distinct, and we can evidence that and show you that quite clearly.
Okay, I'm going to bring
the context here is really, really important. The first point to note is that we are in a biodiversity crisis, and those reasons have been set out very clearly by the GWCC. I'm not going to repeat those. The other point to note is that already we have lost 1/3, if you like, of the toolkit for fox control through the Hunting with Dogs Act that passed earlier this year. Now, I know there's a licensing scheme in place for that. The feedback that we've had from members thus far is not particularly rosy. We absolutely need to be able to manage predation, and I cannot make that point in any stronger terms. And these devices, humane cable restraints, offer us an opportunity to do that. It's also important to note, Convener, that in the 5-year reviews that have taken place since the ascension of the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act, recommendations have been made to improve Scotland's code-compliant snare, not once, but twice. and they have not been acted upon by Scottish ministers. The recommendations have been there for some time to bring us in line with elsewhere in the UK and bring to fruition humane cable restraints. That has not happened. We have the opportunity to do so now through a well-managed land-based licensing scheme, and I really hope the Minister will listen to that and bring that to fruition as an alternative and as a compromise. Convener, just a point, the fox range in Scotland is dramatically increasing. The 2018 review of fox population in Scotland was quite clear on that, and one of the main reasons for it is the extent and scale of afforestation. And it's unsurprising, I suppose, that in the Southern Uplands and the Southern Upland Moorland Group, representatives of which are here today in the room, snaring is a particularly important method of predation control. So we see in that region, for example, of a survey I did just this week from 2021-2022, 55% of foxes in the Southern Upland region are snared versus 38% shot versus 7% controlled with dogs. So you can see the importance of it in that respect, Convener. And I think, you know, to dismiss this as an issue that's simply about producing vast numbers of game birds is fictitious and misleading. What the motivations of gamekeepers are not singular for that reason. There are multiple drivers as to why gamekeepers carry out predation control, and it is not just about game birds. I want to make that absolutely clear, and anybody that suggests that is clearly not someone that is engaged or spoken with any of the people we have at the back of the room. Convener, and it's worth noting that we did so in conjunction with several land management stakeholders as well. I mean, just to give you kind of a flavour of the key points of the licensing scheme that we've pulled together, Penny's already alluded to the fact that there are certain licensable purposes. Those would need to be satisfied by any prospective applicant. Secondly, they'd have to be able to evidence that no other method of fox control is reasonably practical on the land. And that brings me on to the additional safeguards that we've proposed within this licensing scheme as well. So Jess just mentioned it there, the Humane Cable Restraints Code. What we're talking about here is a statutory code of practice which land managers will have to have regard to when they are carrying out any sort of HCR use. And within that, we've already prescribed, because we know which areas the Minister has concerns, and we've said, for example, that Humane Cable Restraint Code should allude to things like how often humane cable restraints are to be checked, how humane cable restraints are to be set to reduce the likelihood of non-target catch, and how to keep records. And if that wasn't enough, Convener, what we're also including is really robust modification, suspension and revocation provisions as well. So we've given Scottish ministers the power to modify a licence at any time, to suspend or revoke a humane cable restraint if they're satisfied that a relevant person has committed an offence, and indeed they could suspend the licence where they're not satisfied, providing proceedings against an individual or a licence holder were in order. So I think what we've proposed, Convener, constitutes a really reasonable compromise, and ultimately it will allow that crucial conservation work, that protection of livestock work, to carry on in Scotland, but under a strict licensing regime which we have got every confidence that Nature Scot will be able to administer and handle. That's absolutely spot on. I'd agree with that completely. The revocation, suspension and modification provisions that we've included in the draft licensing scheme are robust. And I think the other thing to add to this, Convener, that in light of the fact that there was no impact assessment actually done as to what the implications of this particular proposal would be, I think really the onus is on the Scottish Government to ensure that they do put in some sort of interim measure that will enable the use of HCRs to continue. And it was really, really regrettable, I think, certainly when we were looking at the consultation that came out. You know, there was the statement was made that, you know, the use of live capture traps, for example, were more humane and more efficient. That is just not the case. And I think it's really important that we recognise that as a conservation tool, these things are vital. And as Kate Forbes has just outlined, it will allow land managers to make sensible applications for specified purposes where no other method of fox control is available. We're talking about these limited circumstances on places like the place that Connor works, where they're absolutely fundamental. Convener, just to add, I suppose, an alternative view on this, one of the things that we've got real concerns about is the ability of the Scottish SPCA to operate under a clear presumption of innocence, and that was obviously something that was alluded to in Susan Davies' report. As part of kind of our research before this session today, I actually again consulted with 129 land managers to find out, you know, how many of them had actually trust and confidence in the Scottish SPCA being able to investigate wildlife crime in an impartial and an unbiased way. So we surveyed 129 people in total, and the people that said no to do you have trust and confidence in the Scottish SPCA was 97%, and only 1% said yes. So I do want to just highlight that there is that concern, I think, about the presumption of innocence, and that needs to really be there and established within, I think, these protocols. It's really, really important that we have that, and I just wanted to put that on the record.
Ross Ewing.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, I think just to pick up on a point that we were a little bit concerned about reading through Susan Davies's review, I mean, paragraph 30 makes reference to the fact that Police Scotland and the National Wildlife Crime Unit expressed concern that extending powers to the Scottish SPCA could result in wider crime investigations being disrupted. And to us, you know, we're all committed to tackling wildlife crime and getting it to the absolute lowest levels possible. And to me, when we were reading that particular paragraph, and indeed the police's evidence that they submitted actually to this committee, I mean, it's pretty excoriating. And our worry is that actually we could be compromising potentially some wildlife crime investigations if, as we've said and set out, this protocol isn't really watertight and ironed out. So I think we just really would emphasise the importance of getting that protocol. Just a small correction, Convener, because the right to appeal in the context of the grouse shoot licence is actually to the Sheriff Court, so it would be them that would make the determination of any appeal that was made, and on that they'd be looking at everything on fact and law. So that would be the mechanism through which it would happen. I think we would then reiterate, you know, I think the right to appeal is comprehensively undermined if the regulator actually doesn't need to be satisfied that a relevant offence has been committed. You've sort of got no avenues then, or no evidence that you can throw back if you do want to go down an appeal, if that is the low baseline, you know, without proof that they're essentially setting as being the recommendation. And just to add our thanks to Professor Davies for her to conducting the review in a really rigorous way. Just in terms of our expectations for training, you know, if this is going to come to fruition, our expectation would be, and it's set out in paragraph 26 of Professor Davies's review, but we would hope that anybody involved with investigating wildlife crime would complete the Wildlife Crime Officer 2-day induction course, and along with the investigator training course, which is a 1-week-long training course and repeated twice a year, and indeed more advanced training for those that are perhaps exercising additional powers. Whether that's relevant, I don't know. But I think the salient point here is that those two training courses, which ultimately underpin the investigation of wildlife crime in Scotland, our expectation would be that SSPCA inspectors who are charged and granted these additional powers prior to that happening would have to complete those exact requisite courses. Thanks, Convener. So, I mean, yeah, the establishment of an official investigation as being the basis for licence suspension, in our view, is completely inadequate. We don't think it's potentially legally sound either. Obviously, reference was made last week to the allocation of a crime reference number being the basis on which a licence could be suspended. And I'll quote here from the Scottish Government's own recording and counting rules published in October 2023, which kind of gives a bit of insight as to when a crime reference number is actually allocated. So it says on page 8, in the main, incidents reported to the police as crimes will result in a corresponding crime reports being created. And the inference that we've kind of taken from that is that genuinely it's the case of an allegation sometimes does result in a crime number being allocated. That is really no difference to where we started from with regards to the establishment of an official investigation, and in our view does not provide sufficient legal safeguards to prospective licence holders that actually they couldn't be the subject of a vexatious allegation or something to that effect. So we would strongly, robustly go against the proposal that was floated by the Minister last week.